Big Shaq walks into a high-end restaurant he secretly owns, dressed in casual streetwear. A snobby waiter, judging by his looks, sneers and treats him with disrespect, assuming he doesn't belong. He seats Shaq at a poor table, gives dismissive service, and even questions if he can afford the menu. Shaq stays calm, observing. But when the manager recognizes him and reveals the truth, the waiter's world turns upside down. What happens next? A lesson in respect is about to unfold. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue over the city streets, and Big Shaq walked into the prestigious restaurant, his presence immediately turning heads. Despite being known worldwide, he was dressed simply in a hoodie, a pair of jeans, and sneakers. His outfit was a stark contrast to the tuxedos and fine dresses worn by most of the diners in the upscale establishment. As he pushed open the heavy glass doors, a bell jingled, and the restaurant's atmosphere grew quieter, the diners glancing up to see who had entered. Standing at the entrance was the young, overconfident waiter, who had worked at the restaurant for months, and prided himself on his ability to judge people based on appearances. When he looked up, seeing the well-known rapper dressed casually, he immediately dismissed him. "Another one of those trying to get a free meal," he muttered under his breath. With a scoff, the waiter approached Shaq, offering a thin smile. "Good evening, sir," he said, the words almost dripping with condescension. "Do you have a reservation?" Big Shaq smiled back, unfazed. "No, just a table for one," he replied calmly. The waiter's eyebrow twitched, annoyed by the casualness of the request. Well, our best tables are reserved," the waiter said, his tone implying that Big Shaq wasn't worthy of sitting at the prime spots. "But I suppose I can seat you in the back." He gestured toward a dimly lit corner near the kitchen, where the noise and clatter of dishes could be heard. Shaq glanced over at the area, where a few lonely tables were scattered. He could sense the waiter's judgmental gaze, the silent assumption that someone like him wasn't a regular patron of such an elite establishment. Rather than reacting to the insult, Shaq just nodded. "That'll work." The waiter led him to the corner table, muttering something about how people like Shaq didn't appreciate fine dining anyway. As they walked through the restaurant, Shaq noticed the glances from other diners. Some looked at him curiously, others with mild disdain. The waiter seemed to take extra pleasure in leading him through the dining room, making sure everyone could see where the unsuitable guest was being seated. Once Shaq was seated, the waiter threw down the menu in front of him, again with a lack of care and professionalism. He didn't even wait for Shaq to settle in before he coldly said, "I'll be back to take your order in a moment. I hope you'll make a proper choice." Shaq glanced up at him, a smile tugging at his lips, but his eyes remained steady. "Take your time," he said softly, watching the waiter walk away. As the waiter disappeared into the back, Shaq leaned back in his chair, fully aware of the judgment and the quiet whispers around him. But he wasn't bothered. In fact, he was almost amused. It was clear that the waiter had no idea who he was. That made it all the more interesting. Little did the waiter know that the man he had just dismissed as unworthy of the restaurant was about to teach him a valuable lesson in humility. Shaq settled into his corner table, the dim lighting making the space feel distant and isolated from the bustling atmosphere of the rest of the restaurant. His mind wasn't on the setting, though. It was on the interaction with the waiter, who seemed intent on treating him as though he didn't belong. The distant sounds of clinking silverware and murmured conversations filled the air, but Shaq's focus was solely on the table, trying to avoid the judgmental stares of the other patrons. He watched as the waiter interacted with other customers, offering a level of service that seemed worlds apart from what he had received. The waiter took his time with each guest, greeting them warmly, pulling out their chairs with careful attention, and smiling as he recommended specials with a genuine tone. However, when it came to Shaq, the warmth was absent. There was no small talk, no attempt at making him feel welcome. In fact, the waiter appeared to be avoiding any sort of meaningful conversation with him, instead focusing on the guests in the more prominent areas of the restaurant. A few moments passed, and Shaq's patience began to wear thin as the waiter still hadn't returned to take his order. He looked around, noticing the waiter's blatant favoritism for the other customers. A couple in the middle of the room were laughing, and the waiter smiled brightly, leaning in close to suggest a bottle of the finest wine. He then moved to another table where an older gentleman appeared to be debating between two dishes, and the waiter offered his assistance, gently explaining the flavors and ingredients. But with Shaq, there was no such consideration. No offer of wine pairing, no questions about his preferences, just silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the waiter returned to Shaq's table holding a menu in one hand and a notepad in the other, but he still didn't seem eager to engage. "Ready to order, or are you still deciding?" The waiter asked, his tone flat and uninterested. There was no warmth in his voice, just an impatience that seemed to imply he thought Shaq wasn't capable of making a quick decision. Shaq didn't rise to the provocation. He glanced down at the menu, scanning the offerings, but he already knew what he wanted. He was used to fine dining, even if the waiter didn't realize it. "I'll have the lobster bisque to start, and for the main, the filet mignon. Medium rare," he said evenly, his voice calm without a trace of the offense he had felt. The waiter barely looked up as he scribbled down the order, almost dismissive in his actions. "Anything to drink?" he asked, almost as if he was hoping Shaq would decline. Shaq paused for a moment, his eyes locking with the waiter's. "I'll have the red wine, a bottle of your finest," he replied, keeping his tone cool. The waiter nodded curtly, not meeting his gaze, before he turned and walked away without another word. The air seemed heavier now, and Shaq noticed a few other diners glance his way, some with puzzled expressions, others with subtle amusement. It was as if they were all waiting for something to happen. Shaq didn't mind. It didn't bother him at all. Instead, he simply sat back, enjoying the irony of the situation. He knew the waiter had misjudged him, but what the waiter didn't realize was that Shaq wasn't someone who needed to prove his worth through showy gestures or fancy clothes. He had already made his mark on the world, and in a place like this, he didn't need to be anyone other than who he was. As the waiter disappeared into the back once again, Shaq couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before the man realized his mistake. A few minutes later, the restaurant manager, a middle-aged man in a crisp suit, made his rounds through the dining room, offering polite greetings to the diners. He stopped at Shaq's table, taking a moment to scan the room. When his gaze fell on the lone figure sitting in the corner, the manager's expression shifted immediately, a look of surprise crossing his face as he recognized who was sitting there. Big Shaq was not just another customer. He was a celebrity, a businessman, and someone with a significant presence. The manager had seen his face on billboards and TV ads, but he wasn't sure why someone like Shaq would be seated at such an out-of-the-way table. Walking over with a welcoming smile, the manager's voice was smooth and polite, but with a hint of uncertainty. "Good evening, sir. I hope everything is to your liking," he said, his eyes subtly scanning the space, as though trying to gauge if Shaq was comfortable. Shaq looked up, a slight smirk tugging at his lips, but he didn't respond immediately. He was observing the interaction with curiosity. "Everything's fine," Shaq replied calmly, his voice even. He knew that the manager's job was to make sure everything ran smoothly, but it was clear that he hadn't noticed the tension that had been building between Shaq and the waiter. The manager looked at the table and noticed the waiter's absence. A moment of realization flashed in his eyes. He knew that Shaq had been seated at the back, away from the other guests, and the waiter had barely given him any attention. A subtle frown crossed the manager's face as he began to walk away, likely intending to check on the staff. Before he could take another step, however, the waiter reappeared, stepping briskly from the kitchen with a small tray in hand. As he passed by, the waiter nodded to the manager, but his eyes shifted toward Shaq, who had been watching the scene unfold. "Is everything all right here?" the manager asked, his voice tightening as he observed the waiter's attitude. The waiter hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, sir," he said in a clipped tone. "Everything's fine." But there was something off about the way he said it, as though he was trying to avoid the subject entirely. He kept his gaze averted from Shaq's direction, but his unease was palpable. The manager narrowed his eyes, sensing something was wrong. He had seen his fair share of uncomfortable moments between staff and guests, but this felt different. As he watched the waiter shuffle around, he suddenly became aware of a more serious issue. The waiter had been treating Shaq with a distinct lack of respect, perhaps even in an attempt to dismiss him based on appearance. That was something that couldn't go unnoticed, especially in a restaurant of this caliber. "I think I need to have a word with you privately," the manager said sternly to the waiter. His voice was no longer as calm or pleasant as it had been. The waiter's face drained of color as he realized the gravity of the situation. As they stepped to the side, Shaq sat quietly, his mind calculating the next move. He wasn't a fan of confrontation, but sometimes it was necessary to put people in their place. He had let the waiter's attitude slide for now, but there was only so much disrespect he could take. The manager and the waiter exchanged words in hushed tones, and although Shaq couldn't hear the specifics, he could guess what was being said. The waiter was likely being scolded for his rude behavior, and the manager was probably explaining how unacceptable it was to treat any guest with such disdain. The waiter, who had once been so sure of himself, now seemed like a deer caught in headlights, stammering out an apology. The scene was becoming more uncomfortable by the second, but Shaq remained composed. He could see the waiter's face redden with shame, but there was a slight hint of defiance in his posture, as though he wasn't quite convinced that he had done anything wrong. The manager's disappointment was evident, and Shaq couldn't help but smile faintly at the unfolding drama. A few moments passed before the manager turned back to Shaq, his expression one of genuine concern. He began to approach with more caution, his previous demeanor replaced with a more respectful air. "I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience, sir," the manager said, bowing his head slightly. "Please allow me to make it right." Shaq gave him a small nod, silently appreciating the effort to smooth things over. He wasn't in the mood to escalate the situation any further. He had made his point. The manager was quick to offer a few compliments and assurances that the service would improve, but Shaq could tell it was all too little, too late. The damage had been done. As the manager walked away to deal with the waiter, Shaq leaned back in his chair, calmly observing the shift in the restaurant's atmosphere. His experience told him that this wasn't over yet, but the waiter's fate had already been sealed. Now it was only a matter of time before the man realized the full extent of his mistake. The manager quickly walked away, still visibly flustered to deal with the situation with the waiter. Meanwhile, Shaq remained in his seat, his expression unreadable. He took a deep breath, leaning back slightly, observing the surroundings. The quiet murmurs from the other guests continued, but it was obvious that the tension had shifted. People were now subtly looking his way, curiosity evident in their gazes. Shaq couldn't help but smile faintly, knowing the situation was about to take a dramatic turn. He had already made the decision to handle it in his own way. A few moments later, Shaq reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped a few buttons and made a quick call, keeping his voice low so as not to draw attention. As the phone rang, he glanced around, noticing the manager still speaking with the waiter by the kitchen entrance, his gestures becoming more animated as the conversation escalated. The waiter, now visibly uncomfortable, was trying to defend himself, but the manager wasn't hearing any of it. Shaq continued to watch the scene unfold as the call connected. "Hey, it's Shaq," he said calmly when the person on the other end answered. "I need you to come down here. We've got a little issue." He paused for a moment as the voice on the other end responded, then added, "Yeah, just hurry." He hung up the phone with a quiet snap and sat back in his chair, knowing the person he'd called would arrive soon. He didn't need to say more. The person on the other end was someone who understood how to handle delicate situations like this, and things were about to get real interesting. Within minutes, the restaurant's atmosphere shifted again. The manager, still in conversation with the waiter, suddenly looked over toward the entrance as a well-dressed man in his late 40s walked through the door, exuding a quiet confidence. It was clear that this new arrival wasn't just another diner. His stature and demeanor were unmistakable, and his presence was enough to make the entire restaurant notice. The manager's face drained of color as he immediately recognized the man. The person who had just walked in was the owner of the restaurant. This man was no stranger to the restaurant's operations. He was a no-nonsense type, someone who ensured that everything ran smoothly. But to the waiter, this was the person he had least expected to see in that moment. As the owner walked past the tables, the tension in the room grew. He was calm, yet there was an undeniable authority in his steps. His eyes briefly met Shaq's, and a silent understanding passed between them. The owner approached Shaq's table, his gaze briefly flicking toward the now distraught waiter. He smiled politely at Shaq, though there was a certain edge to his expression. "Mr. O'Neill, it's a pleasure to see you. I hope everything's been going well," he said smoothly, keeping his voice steady despite the awkward atmosphere. Shaq looked up, nodding with a calm smile. "Everything's fine," he replied, though there was a hint of amusement in his tone. "Just dealing with a little misunderstanding." The owner glanced briefly at the waiter, who had frozen in place, his face a mixture of guilt and fear. It was clear that the owner had caught on to what was happening. Without skipping a beat, he turned to the waiter and said, "I'll need a word with you now." His tone was firm, and the waiter, now pale and sweating, stammered an apology under his breath. The manager stood awkwardly by, unsure of whether he should intervene, but it was obvious that the owner was in control now. The owner's voice dropped slightly as he turned back to Shaq. "I'm truly sorry, Mr. O'Neill, for the way my staff has treated you tonight. I assure you, this isn't how we operate here." His eyes were sincere, but there was also a deep frustration in them. He wasn't angry with Shaq, but with the situation that had unfolded due to the waiter's blatant disrespect. Shaq nodded once again, his calm demeanor never wavering. "I appreciate it," he said simply, "but I think it's important we all learn a lesson about how we treat people, no matter who they are." He glanced pointedly at the waiter, whose face had turned an even deeper shade of crimson. The owner's eyes flicked to the waiter before looking back at Shaq. "You're absolutely right," he said, his voice softening but still carrying the weight of authority. "We strive for excellence here, and that includes treating every guest with the utmost respect." The waiter, his voice barely audible, finally found the courage to speak. I'm so sorry, sir," he said to Shaq, his eyes cast downward in shame. "I didn't realize who you were. I made a terrible mistake." Shaq took a deep breath considering the apology. He wasn't one to hold grudges, but he also believed in accountability. "It's all right," he said, his tone steady but firm. "Just remember, you never know who you're serving. Everyone deserves respect, no matter how they look or where they come from." The owner nodded, his expression softening as he addressed the waiter one last time. "I'll make sure you understand the importance of proper service going forward. For now, I'll let you go. But this better never happen again." He turned back to Shaq. "Mr. O'Neill, if there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let me know. We'll ensure you have a better experience from here on out." Shaq smiled slightly, nodding in acknowledgement. "No need to make a scene, but I appreciate it." With that, the owner walked away, and the waiter shuffled off to attend to his duties, no doubt shaken by the gravity of the situation. Shaq took a sip of his water, feeling a sense of calm settle over him as he realized the lesson had been delivered, both to the waiter and to anyone who had witnessed the exchange. Respect, he knew, was something everyone deserved, regardless of who they were or what they looked like.